Hey, everybody, welcome to Module 7. We are in our second week of fiction writing, and this week we're talking about structure and design in writing. In other words, in writing fiction. And in other words, that has to do with how you tell the story. Like, in what order do you tell the story? How do you give the details? How do you design the whole thing? We're going to talk about understanding how to organize a story because when you organize it, that's how you make it engaging for your reader. That's how you take events and turn them into something artistic or engaging and something that people will really want to stick with you all the way to the end. So, the first thing we need to talk about when we're talking about structure and design in fiction is we have to talk about this idea of story versus the idea of plot. Story is what happens, just the events that happen. It's a chronological recounting of events. Very simply stated, it's boy meets girl, boy falls in love, etc. And then the story about that includes everything, the events, the characters, how they feel about it, everything that was happening in the periphery. It's just everything about that chronological event. Now, plot is a little bit different. Plot is what we actually do when we're writing the fiction, when we're creating our piece of art from the story. So, plot is how a writer chooses to arrange those events. Plot is often non chronological. We don't always tell a story from beginning to end. Sometimes we tell the story with the events a little bit out of order, and we do that because we're intentionally choosing to do that to create a certain type of effect. So, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about some different ways that you can take a story and plot it to make it engaging for your reader. Now, let's talk a little bit about the reader's role. When a reader comes to your piece of work or a piece of fiction, what they very quickly encounter is that fiction is rarely presented in simple chronological order, like I just said. Part of the fun and part of the challenge for a reader is piecing together the chronology from the writer's creative structure. So, writers use structure as an artistic tool to create those different effects for their readers. Let's go over some common plot structures. Now, the first one is chronological plot structure. I have to say, of course, some stories are told from beginning to end, and they just follow the events from how it started, what happened next, all the way to the end. Events are presented in sequence from beginning to end. They can also be told chronologically, but backwards. They can be reversed, told from end to beginning. Chronological stories can span many, many years, or they can be very short and they can be just a single moment. And sometimes the chronological fiction, it can be a long piece, but it can span just a single moment and it's very in depth on that single moment. Now, one quick tip for you as a writer, shorter spans of time are often easier to write when you are doing a chronological story. The reason for that is the longer the span of time, the more you're tempted to include details that don't really matter for the story and you get into the weeds a little bit. Um, and you have to really determine what's essential and what's not. So that's something that you can fall into when you're telling a story from chronologically from beginning to end over a long span of time. Now, the second common plot structure, and I think we see this very, very, very often. When I describe this to you, you're going to say, "Oh, yeah, that is a very common way for people to tell stories." It's the frame story. Now, a frame story begins present day and then it moves to the past and tells what happened in the past as the main story. And then it will return to the present for the resolution. So, a really great example of this is The Princess Bride. Most of us have seen that movie. This is a story that starts with a character reminiscing and it ends back in the present. So, if you're not familiar with The Princess Bride, the main story is framed by this outer story of a grandfather and a grandson who are the grandson is sick and the grandfather is reading The Princess Bride. It's a book to his sick grandson. And the narrative constantly returns to the grandfather and grandson throughout the movie, sometimes interrupting the fairy tale to comment, ask questions, or react to the plot. And in the end, after the main adventure concludes, the frame closes with the grandfather and the grandson, bringing us back to the original present day setting. So we kind of get two stories in one with a frame story. We get the present day story, and then we get the main story, which is in the past. Another common plot structure is the alternating time periods. This one bounces back and forth. The story switches between two equally important periods, sometimes present to past, sometimes present to future. There are lots of creative ways to employ this structure. One tip for using this is to always make sure that when you transition between time periods, that you create transitions that are smooth and that carry your reader with you in time so that they don't get mixed up as they read your story. And finally, there's a category where we just lump all the other things that writers do, other creative structures. A lot of writers of fiction will experiment with structure and kind of take their reader along on a ride and kind of ask a lot of the reader. Literary short stories do this, especially literary fiction or literary flash fiction can really do this a lot and ask a lot of us. Um, it presents us with unconventional formats, almost like a puzzle, and you have to figure out what is this writer doing? They're telling me a story, but how are they telling me the story? And part of the fun is figuring out just the structure of the story. Now, if you haven't already done it, I want you to go and read T.C. Boyle's The Hitman. It's in your text. Uh, I've got different people using different formats of text. So go find that, take a second to read it. And as you do, I want you to notice the unconventional format that T.C. Boyle uses. He's known for this. He is a writer who has always challenged his readers to really dig deep and get into the story with him and try to figure out what he's doing. Now, in this one, the story is told in disconnected vignettes, each revealing a different moment or perspective in the protagonist's life. Rather than presenting events in a traditional chronological order, Boyle creates a fragmented, mosaic like narrative structure that mirrors the erratic and episodic nature of the hitman's existence. Now, that's something that's really cool about this story. Um, the structure of the story reflects the type of life that the protagonist has. And that's, in my mind, what makes short fiction artistic. It's kind of an artistic endeavor, which is really cool. Now, unusual, like I just mentioned, unusual and nonlinear structures can reflect a character's experience or enhance the story's emotional impact. Now, one very common structural component that fiction writers like to use is the flashback. And we need to talk about that a little bit here because it is such a widely used tool. Let's talk about how to use flashbacks well and maybe some things to avoid when you're using flashbacks. Flashbacks appear in almost all story structures, and they can be brief, like one sentence, or they can be lengthy, like entire scenes. Now, let's go over some guidelines. When you're using flashbacks, ensure each flashback is necessary. Again, this is one of those things where you have to decide as the writer, is the information I'm including here necessary for this story? If it's not necessary to move the story forward, if it's just a random detail, then I can probably leave it out. The same is true for flashbacks. If the events of the flashback aren't important for the story, there's no need to include it. Use smooth transitions. Provide a trigger or motivation for the character's memory. Remember, you're taking a reader along with you, and your reader is very, very smart. Always assume that your reader is very, very smart, but give them a little something to help them get into the flashback with you. Avoid overly long flashbacks and never nest flashbacks within flashbacks. Too much time shifting can confuse or jar the reader, and each flashback should serve the story's purpose, like I said before. Okay? Now, why are transitions so important? And how do they keep stories smooth? Strong transitions are crucial to move readers comfortably through time shifts. So, when you're making those flashbacks, those transitions are really important. You need to use cues like setting dialogue, sensory details, internal thoughts to signal changes in time and prevent confusion. Now, there's a lot of examples in your text. You're reading a lot of stories in your text, and they will show you some effective methods. I want you to be kind of looking for those flashbacks and the transitions that are used to effectively get readers in and out. Study these for inspiration. Now, below this video, I am posting a document that will be helpful for you when it comes to writing flashbacks. It's got tons of examples. I realize in the video here, I'm not giving you really any examples. And the reason for that is I want to keep this video relatively short so that you can watch it in one sitting and get the gist of the lesson. That's why I do sometimes I'll do these videos without a ton of examples because examples are the things that draw the videos out really, really long. But I want you to get the main ideas here, and I want you to go looking in the text and in the stories to see what I'm talking about there. Okay. So, but like I said, I'm going to give you a document below this video that has a whole bunch of examples of how to go in and out of flashbacks and how to effectively do that. I think the most important thing to remember when you're plotting a fictional story is that your goal is to find meaningful moments. Okay. You have to find the meaningful moments in the story and put those in the plot. Great fiction, like real life, is made up of small but important moments. Plots never recount every single thing that happens in a character's life. A writer chooses the events that are specifically meaningful to the story and includes only those. That's what makes stories created in a fictional way artistic. Focus your story on those moments that matter most to your character. Now, this week we're going to write a fun story in the style of T.C. Boyle's The Hitman. So I want you to go to that story, spend a little time with it, and then you're going to be working on that, your own form of that in the discussion. So make sure that you get going on that. If you have any questions at all this week, please feel free to reach out via the inbox and let me know. And I look forward to seeing what you come up with.